I'm very happy here to have László Bodis, Deputy State Secretary for the Innovation and CEO of the Hungarian Innovation Agency. So, László, the first question is about what are the most common challenges that SMEs and startups in Hungary and even the broader CEE region, which is why we are here in this Emerging Europe conference. What are the challenges that they face when they need to raise capital?
We see that in Hungary especially, but I could say in the broader region, we have very good foundations to enhance and accelerate our innovation ecosystem and our startup ecosystem. But obviously we have those challenges you referred to as well. Most of them, I would say, is connected, one, to capital. There is a significant gap between the amount of capital that Hungarian or the regional startups can apply for. Obviously to venture capitalists. But the second challenges we do face is much more a cultural one. And I would say it's a European challenge and not just a Hungarian, which is connected to how do we see and how do we think of failure. If you look at the US or the East Asian ecosystems, obviously this cultural mindset is very different. And the third challenge we face is especially in the technological sector and in terms of deep tech companies is that we have very good foundations in science. In Hungary especially, in my opening speech, I referred to the fact that Hungary has a global rank in terms of per capita Nobel laureates, Nobel Prize winners. Our rank is 11 globally, so we have very good foundations in science. We have very good talents in science, but what we are struggling with is how can we turn or transfer these research results which now appear in publications to innovative technologies, innovative products and services.
And how is the Hungarian Innovation Agency actually helping to materialize this talent, as you mentioned, into the real world, and in companies and the economy?
Obviously, when we are thinking of how can we accelerate the innovation ecosystem in Hungary, and I'm not just talking about how the Hungarian Innovation Agency can do that, but as a Deputy State Secretary, obviously I'm responsible for the whole ecosystem. And through that, we define four key topics that we see that the state has a role. The first is the educational part. The second is the structural part, I would say. That means that the universities and research institutions must have those structures that enhance technology transfer. The third topic is obviously the taxation and regulation, and the fourth is financing or funding. And I'm very happy that the Hungarian Innovation Agency plays a decisive role in the educational part. First pillar I mentioned. We initiated a new program 5 years ago called the Hungarian Startup University Program. This is a specific program for university students through which they can get introduced to the startup ecosystem, to the innovation ecosystem of Hungary. How can they establish a new startup company? How can they create a spin-off company based on their research results? And in the last 5 years in this program, more than 20,000 Hungarian university students have been enrolled, which is around 8% of the total student population, which I would say is significant. So the talent is here. They think more and more of creating a new startup company themselves. And we have very good scientific foundations. And that's why I think that Hungary's deep tech ecosystem or startup ecosystem, but in broader terms, this region's ecosystem is just before leveling up.
Wonderful. So we know about everything related to universities and talent, right? But there's this need for funding, as you mentioned, So how the access to funding in the venture capital industry is limited in general, especially when you're thinking about the scale up and companies that want to grow. What can we do to help those companies to grow, not only emerging Europe, but Europe in general, right?
That's what I wanted to start my answer with, is that this is not regional or Hungarian challenge. It's a European challenge. If I look at the global numbers, I see that 52% of the venture capital funds are raised in the US, 40% is raised in China, and only 5% is raised in the European Union. And that's why what you mentioned is absolutely true, that the scale-ups actually must go to the US, must go to East Asia to raise that high amount of capital they need. What can we do? Obviously, first of all, I think, and it has to be done or accomplished on the European level, is how can we get the most important institutional investors which have large amount of money, basically pension funds, etc., to invest more in venture capital. If I look at the international best practices, for example, in the US, in the 1970s, 80s, there was a regulation change through which these huge private companies or who have the most amount of money to invest in, pension funds, as I mentioned, were able to invest their money in more riskier assets like venture capital. This is not the case here in Europe, and that's one very important message. Obviously, there is a second, I would say, thinking, and we do have a debate in the Hungarian startup ecosystem as well. Is it a chicken-egg problem or not? What I mean is that, do we need more capital or do we need more great startups? For example, in Hungary, this is still a debate that do we have enough capital for the very limited amount of new startups, or we do need much more capital to have more startup companies. In my personal opinion, much more capital would make a good development for the ecosystem, because if you have more money, then you can be more risk-taking, because the venture capital firms, as I see, are very much risk-averse in Hungary and in the Central European region as well. So if we would have more money, we would have more great startup companies. But obviously, this huge amount of capital can only come from institutional investors and not from private people.
Yeah, institutional investors and privates, I'll say, more than the public, because the problem with Europe in general is that the public entities, government agencies, they're doing their job, right? They're trying to dynamize these ecosystems, no? But then when you need larger amounts of capital for growth stage, you need someone else to step in,
Obviously, the governments could play a decisive role in bringing new money to the venture capital funds. But what I see in Europe, again, on a European level, is that the state aid rules we do have in Europe, globally in the European Union, are just killing the venture capital ecosystem. So we struggled in the last 10 years in Hungary to create from public funds new venture capital funds. But to be honest, and obviously I'm working for the government, but you can also ask private sector partners or venture capitalists, they were not as successful as we would like to see, because public money and state aid rules just are not in line with the basics and foundations of venture capital, which is risk-taking. Public money and risk-taking in Europe on a European level is not in line yet. And obviously we are working on, from Hungarian side, to convince the European Commission to make some changes in the rules.
And beyond capital, what other ways do you think the Hungarian Innovation Agency can help to develop, especially thinking about these scale-ups, growth stage companies, which is where I think in general we're lacking of in Europe?
So we are talking about innovative SMEs or scale-up companies. What the Hungarian Innovation Agency is doing, and this is one of our flagship projects, is the EXPAND program, through which we help these companies to enter foreign markets, and obviously not just in the region or in Europe, but globally. We help them enter the US market, we help them enter the Chinese market, the Singaporean, the Korean, and besides, obviously, the UK, Germany, and other European markets, because that's where we see they need help. We established a startup roundtable 1.5 years ago, and we asked the ecosystem players, what can we do from the Hungarian Innovation Agency side to help the startup ecosystem develop? And they said 3 things. The first was education. I already had some comments on that. The second was on the regulational changes. And the third was the international visibility of the ecosystem and helping their startup companies to enter the different foreign markets and have their capital raised or have their new customers or anything they need. And through this EXPAND program I mentioned, we help the Hungarian startups to thrive globally.
Wonderful. This brings me to my last question, which is looking ahead. What are your priorities for strengthening this role that Hungary has as an innovation hub for the region? What are your priorities, and how can you make international investors think about bringing their money here to the region and specifically to Hungary?
You mentioned innovation hub. I would say innovation powerhouse we would like to see in the coming years of Hungary. And what we are very, very heavily focusing on right now is what I already mentioned, is how can we get the very high-level research results, scientific publications, to transfer them to innovative technologies, companies, at the end of the day. And through this mindset, our first and foremost task to do is first We are establishing currently with the best performing Hungarian universities, technology transfer companies. The only goal and task of these companies is to bring the research results into the industry, into the economy through startup companies. The second is we have to help venture capitalists raise more capital, and we are trying new ways in public financing through which we can enhance and help our venture capitalists, private venture capitalists, to raise more capital in the deep tech investments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.